The cigarette smoke hung thick in the grand ballroom of New York's Waldorf Astoria as January wind rattled the windows in 1941. Beneath crystal chandeliers that had witnessed 1,000 corporate celebrations, America's most powerful industrialists sat transfixed by the man standing at the podium. William Knudsen, president of General Motors, the largest corporation in human history, had just delivered the most audacious challenge of the industrial age. The first half of 1941 is crucial, Knudsen declared, his Danish accent still faintly coloring words that would reshape the world. Gentlemen, we must outbuild Hitler. The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was stunned. These men controlled the machinery of American manufacturing, yet what Knudsen proposed seemed impossible. Convert automobile assembly lines to produce weapons of war. Match German industrial efficiency while maintaining civilian production. The mathematics alone defied belief. What made the moment even more extraordinary was Knudsen's personal sacrifice. 3 months earlier, Franklin Roosevelt had summoned him to Washington with an offer that shocked Wall Street. Abandon his $1 million GM salary to become director of production for the princely sum of $1 per year. Without hesitation, Knudsen had accepted, trading corporate luxury for a government desk and the weight of democratic survival on his shoulders. But as Knudsen gazed across the sea of skeptical faces, Henry Ford II, Chrysler executives, suppliers who'd built empires on predictable peacetime contracts, he harbored a secret that would have staggered even his closest allies. The challenge he'd just issued wasn't ambitious, it was conservative. What American industry was about to accomplish would so thoroughly overwhelm German expectations that Wehrmacht intelligence officers would literally refuse to believe their own reconnaissance reports. In smoke-filled rooms across Berlin, German analysts were already calculating American production potential based on carefully gathered intelligence. Their assessment, manageable. Their strategic planning, confident. Their fundamental assumption that American car manufacturers, however large, remained bound by traditional European concepts of industrial organization and capacity. They were about to discover the devastating cost of underestimating American innovation. As the applause finally erupted in the Waldorf ballroom, echoing off marble walls that had hosted robber barons and railroad kings, none of those assembled industrialists could imagine the scope of deception they were about to orchestrate. Within 18 months, German spies would be documenting American tank production with meticulous precision, filing reports that confirmed every German assumption about limited manufacturing capacity. What these spies would never discover was that their entire intelligence operation was being orchestrated by the very people they were surveilling. The question hanging in that smoky air wasn't whether American industry could outbuild Hitler. It was whether German intelligence would survive the psychological destruction of discovering that everything they thought they knew about American capabilities was systematically, deliberately, catastrophically wrong. October 15, 1943. The Consolidated Motors plant in Hammond, Indiana hummed with controlled chaos as Klaus Weber descended from the employee bus, his forged credentials identifying him as Robert Mitchell, machinist transferred from a shuttered Ohio factory. 3 months of preparation had perfected his American accent, memorized baseball statistics, and studied the industrial geography of the Midwest with Germanic thoroughness. His mission was elegantly simple: document American tank production capabilities and confirm Berlin's assessment that U.S. manufacturing remained constrained by inefficient organization and limited industrial vision. Weber's handlers in German intelligence had selected Hammond precisely because it represented what they believed to be typical American production: solid but unspectacular, hampered by democratic inefficiencies that German engineering had long since overcome. The facility produced M4 Sherman tanks at what aerial reconnaissance suggested was a respectable but manageable pace. Weber's job was to provide ground truth verification of numbers that would influence Wehrmacht strategic planning for the defense of occupied Europe. What Weber couldn't see, as he badged through security that morning, was Harold Brennan, the grizzled floor supervisor with 23 years of factory experience and an eye for details that didn't belong. Brennan noticed everything: how Weber held his tools with unfamiliar precision, the slight hesitation before using American slang, the too careful pronunciation of technical terms that any real machinist would slur through habit. Most tellingly, Weber's hands were soft, no calluses, no ingrained grease stains, no scars from decades of metalwork. But Brennan said nothing. Instead, he watched. The production line Weber documented confirmed German expectations perfectly. 12 Sherman tanks rolling off the assembly line each day across 2 shifts. Workers appeared competent, but not exceptional. Machinery standard for American industry. Organization efficient, but unremarkable. His evening radio transmissions painted a consistent picture for Berlin. American production was steady, but limited, vulnerable to disruption, insufficient to sustain prolonged European operations. What Weber failed to notice was the deliberate theater surrounding him. 3 floors beneath the factory, Margaret Caldwell supervised the night shift that officially didn't exist. Her security badge granted access to sections that appeared on no blueprint Weber could access, underground assembly lines carved out during the plant's rapid wartime expansion. While Weber counted 12 tanks daily, Caldwell's teams completed 36 additional units in spaces that defied every assumption about American industrial organization. The deception required extraordinary coordination. Raw steel arrived in shipments marked for standard production, but 30% was immediately diverted through hidden loading docks. Finished tanks rolled out through camouflaged exits during shift changes when fewest eyes were watching. Every rivet, every weld, every component had to be accounted for without creating discrepancies that might attract attention from increasingly sophisticated German surveillance networks operating throughout the industrial Midwest. Frank Garrison managed logistics that made the impossible routine. His shipping department maintained 2 completely separate sets of records: sanitized versions accessible to anyone with basic clearance, and classified documentation tracking the facility's true output. Every night, convoys of Sherman tanks departed Hammond under cover of darkness, following routes mapped specifically to avoid German surveillance posts that American counterintelligence had identified and was carefully monitoring. The psychological pressure on workers involved in the covert operation was immense. Dorothy Fleming, a welder on the underground third shift, had been working 14-hour days for months while maintaining the fiction that she only worked standard 8-hour shifts. Her husband believed she was earning overtime doing routine maintenance work. The truth would have to wait until after the war, if she survived to tell it. Weber's confidence grew as weeks passed. His sources, workers who seemed trustworthy, supervisors who discussed production challenges within his earshot, provided information that reinforced every German assumption about limited American manufacturing capabilities. What he didn't realize was that every source had been carefully selected. Every piece of information meticulously crafted by military intelligence officers who had turned his entire operation into an elaborate psychological experiment. The facility's design supported deception at every level. Electrical consumption was masked through connections to nearby industrial operations. Ventilation systems were camouflaged as standard factory infrastructure. Even the sounds of additional production were muffled through acoustic engineering that redirected noise signatures to match expected patterns for the facility's reported capacity. Captain James Thornton coordinated the broader deception from an office disguised as routine administrative space. His operation extended far beyond Hammond, managing similar misdirection campaigns at production facilities across 17 states. The cumulative effect represented the largest industrial counterintelligence operation in American history, designed to ensure German strategic planning remained based on catastrophically inaccurate assumptions. But Hammond was just one note in a symphony of deception that stretched across the American industrial heartland. Similar operations at Chrysler plants, Ford facilities, and dozens of component manufacturers were feeding German intelligence networks information that painted a consistent picture. American production was manageable, predictable, insufficient to fundamentally alter the strategic balance in Europe. Weber began noticing subtle inconsistencies that troubled him without triggering immediate alarm. Shipping schedules that seemed slightly irregular. Worker conversations mentioning colleagues he'd never encountered. Supply deliveries that appeared larger than visible production would require. But each discrepancy had reasonable explanations that prevented deeper investigation. Meanwhile, the true scope of American production was approaching levels that would have staggered German planners. Vincent Muller, Hammond's actual production manager, coordinated operations completing over 60 Sherman tanks daily across all shifts and hidden facilities. The numbers represented manufacturing efficiency that exceeded German projections for American industrial capacity by margins that would reshape strategic calculations about the war's duration and outcome. The trap was perfect, comprehensive, and utterly convincing. March 6, 1945. Wehrmacht Panther tank commander Wilhelm Bartelborth crouched behind the massive stone buttresses of Cologne Cathedral, his field glasses trained on the bridge spanning the Rhine. What he witnessed in the gray dawn light would haunt him for the rest of his brief remaining life. An endless column of American Sherman tanks rolling through the ancient city streets in numbers that defied every intelligence assessment about enemy production capabilities. Bartelborth lowered his binoculars with hands that trembled, not from cold, but from mathematical impossibility made manifest. He'd been briefed on American industrial capacity. The intelligence was thorough, consistent, verified through multiple sources across 3 years of espionage operations. American tank production was steady but limited, manageable numbers that German defensive planning could accommodate. Yet here, flowing past Gothic spires like a steel river, were more Sherman tanks than German intelligence claimed the Americans could produce in 6 months. The serial numbers his reconnaissance teams had documented suggested manufacturing rates that would require the entire German automotive industry operating at theoretical maximum efficiency. But America was simultaneously producing trucks, aircraft, ships, and maintaining civilian automobile production for essential personnel. The contradiction was destroying Bartelborth's understanding of industrial reality. 800 miles away in Berlin, SS Oberfuhrer Karl Hoffmann was experiencing his own moment of strategic vertigo. Captured Allied shipping manifests spread across his desk revealed serial number sequences on American tanks that suggested production rates impossibly higher than any German spy had reported. The mathematical implications were staggering. If these numbers were accurate, American tank production was operating at nearly 4 times the capacity German intelligence had calculated. Hoffmann reached for the red telephone that connected directly to Wehrmacht High Command. The conversation that followed would trigger emergency meetings questioning everything German intelligence thought it knew about American manufacturing potential. At Hammond, Weber's world was about to collapse with devastating precision. Harold Brennan approached Weber's workstation that morning with an expression that immediately triggered alarm. Instead of the usual casual conversation about production schedules, Brennan handed him a manila envelope containing photographs that Weber recognized with growing horror. Detailed images of underground facilities he'd never suspected existed. assembly lines operating at full capacity 3 levels below the factory floor where he'd been working for months. Surprised, Robert? Brennan's voice carried 23 years of factory experience and months of carefully controlled anger. Or should I say Klaus? The photographs told a story that shattered Weber's entire understanding of American industrial organization. Timestamps indicated round-the-clock production that would have tripled his estimates of Consolidated Motors' manufacturing capabilities. But the images represented only a fraction of the deception orchestrated around his intelligence gathering. Major Daniel Crawford stepped from behind a machinery assembly with documentation that made Weber's blood freeze. Radio transcripts of every transmission he'd sent to Berlin, decoded copies of his encrypted reports, detailed analyses of how German strategic planning had adjusted based on misinformation he'd unknowingly provided. The scope of the operation exceeded anything Weber had imagined possible. Maps showing 17 similar facilities across the Midwest, each running identical deceptions that had compromised German intelligence assessments of American industrial capacity. Production figures revealing actual tank manufacturing rates exceeding German projections by margins that would fundamentally alter the war's timeline. "You documented 12 tanks per day," Crawford explained, with professional courtesy that emphasized how completely Weber's mission had been compromised. "The actual number was 48, but that was just Hammond. We wanted to show you something else." Crawford handed Weber a classified report stamped with seals that made his expertise in German intelligence protocols irrelevant. General Motors Corporation, $13.8 billion in wartime production contracts, 38,000 tanks and tank destroyers, 854,000 military trucks, 206,000 aircraft engines, 119 million artillery shells, all while maintaining refrigerator, production for essential services, and continuing civilian automotive manufacturing for critical personnel. Weber's arrest was conducted with ruthless efficiency that demonstrated how thoroughly his intelligence operation had been monitored, controlled, and exploited. Crawford explained that every aspect of his mission had been orchestrated to feed misinformation to German command. The workers he'd cultivated as sources, the production schedules he'd documented, the technical assessments he'd transmitted, everything had been carefully designed to mislead German strategic planning. Meanwhile, the true scale of American production was becoming apparent to German commanders facing Sherman tanks that appeared on European battlefields faster than their intelligence suggested was possible. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, analyzing intercepted German communications, observed panic spreading through enemy intelligence networks as field reports contradicted every assessment about American industrial limitations. In his underground bunker beneath Berlin, Albert Speer studied reconnaissance photographs that showed American armor concentrations exceeding every calculation based on intelligence reports from the industrial Midwest. As Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, Speer understood manufacturing capacity with scientific precision. What he was observing was mathematically impossible, according to every assessment German intelligence had provided about American industrial organization and productive potential. The psychological impact on Weber was devastating beyond Crawford's expectations. Months of meticulous intelligence gathering had not only failed, but had actively contributed to German miscalculations about American capabilities. His detailed reports had provided false confidence that American production remained manageable, while actual manufacturing capacity was reaching levels that would overwhelm German defensive preparations across multiple theaters. Dr. Robert Ashford, a specialist in industrial psychology consulting for the War Department, documented the emotional trauma experienced by German agents discovering their intelligence operations had been systematically exploited. Weber's case became a textbook example of how successful counterintelligence could turn enemy assets into unwitting tools of strategic misdirection. The facility's true production numbers were staggering even by American standards. While Weber had documented steady output suggesting limited capacity, the combined underground and surface operations were completing tanks at rates that exceeded German monthly production targets in daily shifts. The efficiency achieved under conditions of absolute secrecy was revolutionizing American manufacturing techniques in ways that would influence post-war industrial development for decades. But the Hammond deception represented only one component of an industrial effort reshaping the global balance of military power. Crawford showed Weber intelligence maps revealing the scope of coordinated misinformation campaigns. Facilities across Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, all feeding German intelligence networks carefully crafted data that consistently underestimated American production by catastrophic margins. Weber's interrogation revealed how German strategic planning had become dependent on misinformation provided by compromised spy networks. His reports had influenced decisions about troop deployments, defensive preparations, and resource allocation that were proving disastrously inadequate when confronted with actual American production capabilities. The deception's success was measured not just in tanks produced, but in German strategic miscalculations compounding across multiple theaters. Enemy forces that had planned defensive operations based on limited American armor support were encountering Sherman formations that overwhelmed prepared positions through sheer numerical superiority that German intelligence had calculated as impossible. As Weber was transported to a secure facility for extended debriefing, the tanks he'd never known existed were rolling off assembly lines toward European battlefields where they would demonstrate the devastating effectiveness of the most successful industrial counterintelligence operation in modern warfare history. The mathematical reality was beyond German comprehension. While their intelligence services had documented American tank production as manageable and limited, the actual network of facilities was completing over 800 Sherman tanks every 24 hours across operations that German surveillance had never suspected existed. The industrial achievement extended far beyond military applications. Manufacturing techniques developed to maintain dual production systems were advancing American capabilities in ways that would define post-war economic dominance. Assembly line coordination protocols, quality control systems, and logistical management innovations created under wartime secrecy were establishing foundations for civilian prosperity that would last generations. The Normandy invasion plans being finalized in London during spring 1944 included armor concentrations that would have been impossible without the industrial deception that had consumed Weber's intelligence mission. General Dwight Eisenhower reviewed deployment schedules showing Sherman tank availability that exceeded every pre-war projection about American manufacturing potential, numbers that represented strategic advantages German forces had no preparation to counter. Weber sat in a secure interrogation facility outside Washington, providing details that helped American intelligence understand how thoroughly German strategic planning had been compromised. His debriefings revealed that Berlin's entire approach to defending occupied Europe was based on assumptions about limited American armor support that bore no relationship to actual production capabilities. At Hammond, the covert production facilities emerged from secrecy with celebrations that had been suppressed for months. Workers like Dorothy Fleming could finally acknowledge the scale of their contributions to the war effort. The underground assembly lines that had operated in absolute secrecy were revealed as technological marvels that had advanced American manufacturing capabilities far beyond pre-war levels. Margaret Caldwell, promoted to oversee the transition from covert to open production, coordinated integration of hidden facilities with standard operations. The manufacturing efficiency achieved under conditions of extreme secrecy was being applied to expanded production that would sustain American forces through the final phases of the European campaign. The strategic impact became apparent across multiple theaters simultaneously. In the Pacific, American armor was appearing in quantities that Japanese intelligence had calculated as impossible based on assessments of industrial capacity. The deception network that had misled German planning had also compromised Axis' understanding of American production potential across global operations. The human cost of the operation was finally being acknowledged. Families like those of Frank Garrison and Eleanor Hayes learned about classified work their relatives had been performing for months. The psychological strain of maintaining absolute secrecy while contributing to efforts that would determine the war's outcome had created emotional challenges extending far beyond factory workers directly involved. General George Marshall, reviewing after-action reports from European operations, noted that German defensive preparations had consistently underestimated American armor concentrations by margins suggesting systematic intelligence failures rather than isolated miscalculations. The industrial deception program had achieved strategic effects exceeding every projection about its potential impact. Weber's intelligence reports became required reading for officers training in counter-espionage techniques. His thoroughness in documenting misinformation provided textbook examples of how successful deception operations could manipulate enemy strategic planning through carefully controlled intelligence channels that turned adversaries into unwitting collaborators in their own strategic defeat. The technological innovations emerging from covert production facilities were being transferred to civilian manufacturing sectors where they would influence American industrial development for decades. Assembly line coordination techniques, quality control protocols, and logistical management systems developed under conditions of absolute secrecy proved applicable to peacetime production challenges that would drive unprecedented economic expansion. The economic implications of the covert production network were reshaping understanding of American industrial potential. Manufacturing capacity developed under wartime secrecy was being converted to civilian applications that would generate prosperity exceeding every pre-war economic projection, establishing foundations for global influence that would define the remainder of the 20th century. Today, as global supply chains and manufacturing capabilities span continents, the Hammond deception offers sobering lessons about industrial intelligence and strategic assumptions. Modern analysts studying Chinese manufacturing capacity, European production capabilities, or American reshoring initiatives operate in an environment where the gap between reported and actual capabilities can determine geopolitical outcomes with consequences extending far beyond immediate military applications. The legacy of Weber's failed mission extends beyond historical curiosity to contemporary relevance. In an era when semiconductor production, rare earth mineral processing, and advanced manufacturing capabilities represent strategic assets as important as traditional military hardware, the Hammond deception demonstrates how industrial intelligence failures can reshape global power balances with devastating speed and permanence. The tanks that rolled through Cologne that March morning carried more than armor and ammunition. They represented the triumph of American industrial innovation over traditional European assumptions about manufacturing limitations, economic organization, and the relationship between civilian and military production capabilities. Subscribe for more untold stories of industrial warfare that changed history forever. What other WWII secrets are still hidden in classified archives? Let us know in the comments what you'd like us to investigate next.